Sunday morning, February 7th, 1904. Baltimore is quiet. The banks are locked, the dry goods houses shuttered, the clerks and merchants gone home for the day of rest. Snow lingers in the gutters of German Street, and a cold wind moves through the heart of the business district. This is the commercial engine of Maryland's largest city, block after block of brick and stone warehouses, 6 and 7 stories tall, packed with cotton, paper, leather, whiskey, and hardware. Everything valuable. Everything flammable. Around 10:48 that morning, deep in the basement of the Johnny Hurst & Company building, something goes wrong. Accounts differ. A discarded cigarette, perhaps. A spark from faulty wiring. Whatever the cause, fire finds the stored goods in that dark cellar and begins to feed. There is no one inside to see it. The Hearst building stands on the corner of German and Hopkins Place, a substantial structure filled with cotton and textiles. For a few minutes, the flames climb unseen, drawing air through the elevator shafts and stairwells, turning the building into a chimney. An automatic alarm finally trips, sending the first signal to the fire department at 10:48. Engine companies begin to roll toward German Street, horses straining against the cold, bells clanging through empty avenues. The men who answer do not yet grasp what they are riding toward. They expect a routine warehouse blaze, the kind Baltimore has beaten 100 times before. The city is proud of its fire department, well drilled and equipped, with modern engines and a network of hydrants threaded through the district. On any ordinary day, this would be a manageable thing. But February 7th is not ordinary. The wind is rising. The warehouses are stuffed with the driest, most combustible cargo in the city, and they stand shoulder to shoulder with no gaps between them. The Hearst building's basement is now fully involved, superheated, pressure building behind its walls and windows. The firefighters are still minutes away, unaware that the structure ahead of them is about to become the ignition point for the worst urban fire in Baltimore's history. Inside those walls, gases are gathering, waiting for the moment they will erupt. The first crews reach German Street to find smoke pouring from the Hearst building. They begin stringing hose, coupling lines to the nearest hydrants, preparing to fight what looks like a contained cellar fire. Then the building answers. Superheated gases, trapped in the sealed basement and lower floors, reach their breaking point. A violent explosion tears through the Hearst structure, blowing out windows, hurling glass and burning debris into the street. The blast throws firefighters back and scatters flaming fragments across the rooftops and awnings of neighboring buildings. In an instant, the fire is no longer one building's problem. Burning brands land on the roofs of adjacent warehouses, sliding into the seams and skylights of structures packed with paper and cotton. New fires bloom a half block away almost immediately. The firefighters, still recovering from the shock of the explosion, realize they are now chasing multiple ignitions at once. Chief Engineer George W. Horton takes command and begins calling for more companies. He can see what is unfolding faster than his men can lay hose. The dry goods that make Baltimore rich are also the perfect fuel. Bales of cotton, reams of paper, drums of oil and turpentine, wooden shelving stacked to the ceilings. Each warehouse is a furnace waiting for a match, and the explosion has struck the matches. Within an hour, several buildings on German Street are fully involved, flames leaping between the narrow gaps that separate them. The heat becomes so intense that firefighters cannot approach the front of the fire. The radiant energy alone ignites wooden storefronts across the street. Water from the hydrants hisses into steam before it reaches the core of the blaze. Horton sends out a general alarm, then a second, then calls for every reserve company in the city. Baltimore's entire firefighting force is converging on a few blocks of the business district. And still, the fire grows, block by block, faster than men and horses can respond. What none of them can yet control is the sky itself. The wind that has been rising all morning is about to become the fire's most powerful ally, and it is beginning to turn. By early afternoon, the wind over Baltimore stiffens and shifts, gusting from the southwest at more than 20 miles per hour. It is the worst possible development. The fire, already leaping between buildings, now has a relentless engine driving it forward. Embers no longer drift, they are hurled. Burning brands ride the wind hundreds of feet, landing on distant rooftops, in gutters choked with debris, on wooden cornices and tar paper roofs. Each landing starts a new fire ahead of the main front, and those fires join the wall of flame racing behind them. Firefighters find themselves outflanked. They lay hose to defend one block, only to watch the fire jump over their heads and ignite the buildings behind them. The blaze widens into a moving front of superheated air, so hot that paint blisters and glass melts a full street away. Witnesses describe a roar like a freight train, a churning column of black smoke visible for miles, and a rain of sparks falling across the harbor. The fire pushes east toward the waterfront and the financial district, consuming block after block of the city's proudest addresses. Banks, insurance offices, newspaper buildings, and department stores fall into the advancing line. The Continental Trust Building, one of Baltimore's early skyscrapers, is gutted, though its steel frame survives. Telephone and telegraph lines burn and drop into the streets. The heat generates its own weather, drawing in fresh air at ground level and feeding the fire even more oxygen, a self-sustaining storm of combustion. Chief Horton's men are exhausted, soaked, and being driven backward, foot by foot. The city's water pressure begins to falter as hundreds of hydrants draw from the same mains. It is now brutally clear that Baltimore cannot fight this alone. The fire is consuming ground faster than any single department could ever hope to defend. As afternoon fades toward evening, the flames are marching toward the Jones Falls waterway and the harbor, threatening to take the entire commercial core. Officials make the only decision left to them. They reach for the telegraph and send out a desperate call for help, a plea that will race down the wires to cities up and down the eastern seaboard. The telegraph keys chatter with urgency as Baltimore's plea races outward along the wires. The message is simple and dire. The city is burning. Send everything you have. The responses come quickly. Washington, D.C., just 40 miles south, is first to answer, loading fire engines onto flat cars and dispatching crews by rail. Philadelphia follows, then Wilmington, then cities farther up the line. New York City, more than 180 miles away, prepares its own contingent. Altogether, more than 20 companies from surrounding cities begin converging on Baltimore. The railroads become lifelines. The Baltimore and Ohio and the Pennsylvania Railroad clear their tracks and give the fire trains priority, speeding them through the winter darkness toward the glow on the horizon. On board are steam fire engines, pumpers, hose reels, and hundreds of firefighters who have never seen the streets they are about to defend. They watch through the windows as the sky ahead brightens, an orange dome hanging over the city, growing larger with every mile. In Baltimore, the situation deteriorates through the night. The local companies are stretched to breaking, rotating exhausted men off the lines only long enough to eat and warm themselves before returning. The fire continues its eastward march, and the harbor itself becomes a staging ground as fireboats pump water from the basin. Officials pin their hopes on the arriving reinforcements, imagining fresh engines and fresh crews finally forming a line strong enough to stop the advance. The first out-of-town units arrive within hours, unloading in the freezing night and hauling their equipment toward the flames. Firefighters from Washington and Philadelphia rush to connect their hoses to Baltimore's hydrants, ready to add their pressure to the fight. This is the moment everyone has been waiting for, the turning point when the combined might of the eastern seaboard's fire departments would surely overwhelm the blaze. The crews grab their couplings, kneel at the hydrants, and begin to thread the connections. But something is wrong. The fittings will not turn. The threads do not match. And in that instant, the great rescue begins to collapse before a single stream of borrowed water can reach the fire. It is a catastrophe, hiding in plain sight. The firefighters from Washington, Philadelphia, and beyond drag their hoses to Baltimore's hydrants and discover a maddening truth. Their couplings will not fit. In 1904, there is no national standard for fire hose threads. Every city has developed its own specifications, its own diameter, its own thread pitch. There are hundreds of incompatible coupling designs across the United States. A hose from Washington cannot screw onto a Baltimore hydrant. A Philadelphia connection is useless on Baltimore's mains. The reinforcements the city has prayed for, engines and crews rushed in from every direction, arrive ready to fight and find they cannot draw a single drop from the local supply. Firefighters improvise in the freezing dark. They wrap couplings in canvas and leather, trying to force seals that will not hold. They wedge fittings together and watch water spray uselessly from the gaps, pressure bleeding away before it can reach the nozzle. Some crews manage to draft water directly from the harbor and the Jones Falls, bypassing the hydrant problem entirely. But it is not enough. Much of the borrowed manpower stands idle, watching the fire they came to fight burn beyond their reach. It is a lesson written in flame. The machinery of rescue is worthless if it cannot connect. Chief Horton and the city officials realize that conventional firefighting has failed. The wind still drives the blaze forward, the water lines are crippled, and the reinforcements are hobbled by threads that do not match. The fire continues its march through the financial district, eating into blocks the city cannot afford to lose. Every hour the flames advance, the geography of the disaster grows. Something drastic is required, a strategy that does not depend on water at all. If the fire cannot be extinguished, then perhaps it can be starved, denied the buildings it needs to keep advancing. The officials gather in the smoke and firelight to weigh an extreme and destructive option, one that means turning against their own city to save it. They begin to speak of dynamite, of deliberately blowing structures to rubble, of building empty gaps where the fire would find nothing left to burn. By Sunday evening, February 7th, the men fighting Baltimore's fire understood a hard truth. Water alone would not stop it. The flames had already consumed entire blocks along German and Baltimore streets, and every hydrant they reached seemed to feed a monster that could not be starved. So the city's leaders turned to a weapon born of desperation. If they could not douse the fire, they would tear open a gap it could not cross. They would use dynamite. The logic was brutal but sound. A fire break is empty space. An empty space cannot burn. If crews could level a row of buildings ahead of the advancing flames, the fire would arrive at a void and, deprived of fuel, falter. Engineers and militia moved through the smoke with cases of explosives, packing charges into the foundations of structures that still stood untouched. Merchants who had spent lifetimes building their stores now watched soldiers prepare to blow those stores apart. The first blast thundered through the district, sending brick and timber skyward. Whole facades collapsed inward, and dust rolled through streets already choked with ash. It was a grim inversion of everything a city is meant to be, men destroying Baltimore to save Baltimore. Yet the results were maddeningly uncertain. Some charges failed to bring buildings fully down, leaving jagged rubble that still carried flame. In places, the wind simply lofted burning embers over the gaps, planting new fires beyond the breaks the crews had fought to create. The dynamite bought minutes and yards, not victory. Explosion answered explosion as the demolition teams raced the fire block by block through the freezing night, never certain whether their charges were slowing the blaze or merely adding to the wreckage. It was destruction pitted against destruction, a war measured in shattered walls and collapsing roofs. And still the fire pressed forward, glowing against the winter sky, its edges licking toward the harbor and the untouched neighborhoods beyond. The men wondered how long a city could keep tearing itself apart. The answer would come only when the flames themselves grew tired, after they had burned for nearly a full day and night without pause. The fire that began on the morning of February 7th finally loosened its grip on February 8th after roughly 30 hours of continuous burning. Near the water's edge, where the demolition breaks widened and the wind at last relented, the flames slowed. They found less to feed on, reached the harbor's margin, and began to sink into smoldering heaps. By afternoon, the great wall of fire that had lit the night sky had collapsed into scattered pockets and glowing rubble. What the receding smoke revealed stunned every witness. More than one 500 buildings were gone. Over 70 city blocks, roughly 140 acres of the commercial heart of Baltimore, lay flattened into an unbroken field of ruin. Banks, warehouses, newspaper offices, and department stores that had defined the district for generations were reduced to bare foundations and leaning chimneys. Streets that had bustled with commerce 2 mornings earlier were now canyons of ash, lined with twisted iron and heaps of scorched brick. The financial cost climbed toward an estimated $150 million, an enormous sum for 1904. Entire industries had been erased in a day and a half. Survivors walked the smoking avenues in disbelief, unable to orient themselves in a landscape stripped of every familiar landmark. The tallest structures had been gutted from within, their outer shells standing like hollow monuments to what they had once contained. Steam rose from wet debris where the last hoses had finally reached. Photographers documented block after block of identical devastation, images that would soon travel across the nation as proof of one of the largest urban fires in American history. The scale defied comprehension. A modern business district, the pride of a major American port, had been consumed almost entirely in a single relentless span. Officials began the grim work of accounting, tallying the destroyed properties, mapping the vanished blocks, and preparing for the count that always follows catastrophe on this scale. Investigators braced for the number they most dreaded, the human toll, the list of the dead pulled from beneath the ruins. But when the counting was done, what they found in that record was not a long column of names. It was something no one expected. When the ledgers of the Great Baltimore Fire were finally tallied, the most astonishing figure was the one that never appeared. Contemporary accounts recorded no confirmed deaths directly caused by the blaze. A fire that consumed over 500 buildings across 70 blocks, that burned for 30 hours through the heart of a major city, had somehow claimed no lives in its path. How could such devastation spare every person within it? The answer begins with timing. The fire ignited on a Sunday morning when the business district stood nearly empty. The banks were closed. The warehouses were locked and unstaffed. The offices that on a weekday would have held thousands of clerks and merchants were silent and dark. The very buildings that burned most fiercely were, on that particular morning, the buildings least likely to hold a soul. The fire devoured property, not people. Because the people were simply somewhere else, geography helped as well. The blaze concentrated in the commercial core rather than the crowded tenements and residential streets where families lived. There were fewer homes to trap sleeping occupants, fewer children in the direct path of the flames, and there was warning. The fire, for all its speed, did not strike in an instant. It advanced block by block over many hours, giving those in its way time to flee ahead of it. Word spread through telegraph, through shouting crowds, through the sight of smoke visible for miles. Firefighters and citizens alike could see the danger coming and retreat before it arrived. Human vigilance played its part too. Crews worked in coordinated shifts, evacuating structures before demolishing them, keeping onlookers back from collapsing walls and flying debris. The combination proved decisive. An empty district, a merciful geography, ample warning, and disciplined response. Each factor alone might have failed. Together, they produced a miracle of arithmetic. The disaster that erased a portion of a city left its people intact. And that impossible outcome would shape how the nation remembered Baltimore, not as a graveyard, but as a warning and a lesson. From the ashes, a new city and a new standard were about to rise. The ashes of Baltimore held more than ruin. They held a reckoning. The single most damning failure of those 30 hours had been the hoses that did not fit. The out-of-town engines rendered useless by couplings that could not join Baltimore's hydrants. That humiliation would not be forgotten. In the aftermath, the fire became a national argument for uniformity. Fire officials across the country recognized that a blaze in one city could defeat the help sent from every other, simply because their equipment refused to connect. The movement toward a standardized fire hose coupling gained urgent momentum, driven by the memory of engines sitting idle while Baltimore burned. In time, national standards for hydrant and hose fittings took hold, ensuring that reinforcements arriving from distant cities could finally do the job they came to do. It was a reform written in the wreckage of 1904. Baltimore itself rose again with remarkable speed. Rather than rebuild the vanished district as it had been, the city seized the chance to modernize. Streets were widened to ease congestion and slow the spread of future fires. Utility lines were reorganized, the docks improved, and new buildings raised with fire-resistant construction. Within a few short years, the 70 blocks of blackened rubble gave way to a rebuilt commercial center, more open and more resilient than the one the flames had taken. The Great Baltimore Fire earned its place among the defining urban disasters of American history. Yet its legacy is measured strangely. It is measured not chiefly in what was lost, but in what survived and what improved. A city learned to build better. A nation learned to standardize the tools of rescue. And the record of that catastrophe carried forward the most extraordinary detail of all, the fact that against every expectation, against the scale of destruction that flattened over 500 buildings, the human ledger stayed empty. That is the truth history preserved from those 30 hours in February 1904. More than 70 blocks reduced to ash. A financial heart erased in a day and a night. And yet, when the smoke finally cleared and the counting was done, the astonishing verdict remained. A city burned, yet no one died.